The gunshot echoed across the rolling plains of southeastern Colorado, shattering the autumn stillness that had settled over Willow's modest homestead. Willow Reynolds flinched at the sound but didn't look up from the grave she was digging, her calloused hands gripping the shovel tightly as tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face. This was the third grave she'd dug in 2 years, first her father-in-law, then her young son taken by fever, and now her husband Daniel, shot down by cattle rustlers who'd stolen half their herd. La Junta, Colorado, 1878, was unforgiving to a woman alone. Willow drove the shovel into the hard earth again, ignoring the pain shooting through her shoulders. At 27, she'd already lived several lifetimes of sorrow, but something in her refused to bend completely. Her honey-brown hair had come loose from its practical bun, whipping around her face in the strengthening wind, but she paid it no mind. "Mrs. Reynolds," called a voice, gentle yet firm. "Let me help you with that." Willow didn't look up. "Thank you, Reverend Simmons, but I'll finish it myself." "You shouldn't have to. I need to," she cut him off, her voice cracking slightly. "Please understand." The Reverend nodded solemnly and stepped back, joining the small gathering of townsfolk who had come to pay their respects. Willow felt their stares, some pitying, some concerned, some already calculating how long before she'd be forced to sell the land that had been in Daniel's family for nearly 15 years. After the brief service, people approached with awkward condolences and offers of help. "We could take up a collection," Mrs. Peterson suggested, her plump face pinched with concern. "Just to help you through the winter." "I've got extra preserves," offered another woman. "My boys could help with the remaining cattle," said Mr. Jenkins, the general store owner. Willow thanked them with as much grace as she could muster, but refused each offer firmly. "I'll manage," she said, the words becoming a mantra as the afternoon wore on. Pride was perhaps all she had left, and she clung to it fiercely. As the small crowd dispersed, Sheriff Tom Parker lingered, his weathered face troubled. "Willow, be sensible. You can't run that ranch alone." "I've been running it for months already," she replied, lifting her chin. "Daniel was sick before the end." The sheriff shook his head. "You know what I mean. Winter's coming. You've lost half your stock. The banknote is my concern," she finished for him. "I appreciate your worry, Sheriff, but I'll find a way." After everyone had gone, Willow stood alone by the fresh grave, the wind carrying the first bite of winter. She had exactly $4.17 hidden in a coffee tin, 15 head of cattle remaining, a mortgage payment due in 6 weeks, and no idea how she would survive. But surrender wasn't in her nature. Daniel had loved that about her, even when it drove him to distraction. "I'll keep our home," she whispered to the grave. "I promise." 3 days later, Willow was repairing a section of fence when she spotted a rider approaching from the east. She straightened, wiping her brow with the back of her hand, and reached for the rifle she kept nearby, a habit that had become necessary since Daniel's murder. The stranger rode tall on a magnificent chestnut stallion. As he drew closer, she could make out his features. Strong jaw shadowed with stubble, piercing blue eyes beneath the brim of a well-worn Stetson. His clothes were trail dusty but of good quality, and the way he handled his horse spoke of years in the saddle. He reined in about 20 feet from where she stood, respecting her boundary. "Afternoon, madam," he called, his voice carrying a slight drawl. "Name's Ross Galloway. I heard in town you might have work." Willow studied him cautiously. "Who told you that?" "Sheriff Parker mentioned you lost some stock recently. Said you might need help rounding up what's left before winter sets in." Willow's fingers tightened around her rifle. "Sheriff Parker talks too much." The stranger, Ross, smiled slightly. "He seemed concerned for your welfare, madam." "No offense meant." None taken, she replied stiffly. But I'm afraid the sheriff was mistaken. I can't afford to hire help right now. Ross dismounted with an easy grace, though he kept his distance. I understand times are hard. I'm not looking for much, just meals and a place in your barn would do. I'm heading to Denver eventually, but I'm not in any hurry. Willow hesitated. The offer was tempting, desperately so. The remaining cattle had scattered across the foothills after the rustlers' attack, and bringing them in alone before the first snow would be nearly impossible. But accepting help felt dangerously close to charity. "Why would you work for just room and board?" she asked suspiciously. Ross shrugged. "I've been drifting since the war. Sometimes it's nice to stay put for a spell, especially with winter coming." His eyes, direct and honest, met hers. "I'm good with cattle, madam, and I can fix just about anything that's broken." There was plenty broken at the Reynolds ranch, and they both knew it. Willow studied him a moment longer, weighing necessity against pride. "1 week," she said finally. "We'll see how it goes, but I'll only have work for you until the first snowfall. After that, you'll need to move on." Ross nodded, touching the brim of his hat. "Fair enough, Mrs. Reynolds. You can put your horse in the corral and your gear in the tack room," she said, turning back to the fence. "And it's Willow. Mrs. Reynolds makes me feel like my mother-in-law." "Yes, Madam Willow," he corrected himself. "I'll see to my horse and then help you finish this fence." She watched from the corner of her eye as he led his stallion toward the barn, his stride confident but not cocky. There was something steady about him that reminded her of Daniel, though physically they were nothing alike. Daniel had been fair and lean, while Ross Galloway was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and sun-browned skin. Willow forced the comparison from her mind. The arrangement was temporary just until she could get back on her feet. Nothing more. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Ross sat at her kitchen table cleaning his revolver while Willow went over her accounts. The numbers were even more disheartening than she'd feared. "Bad news?" Ross asked quietly, noticing her expression. Willow sighed, closing the ledger. "Nothing I can't handle." Ross didn't push, just nodded and continued his methodical cleaning. After a moment, he said, "I noticed your north pasture fence is down in several places. I could start there tomorrow." "The cattle are the priority," Willow replied. "Once we've rounded up what's left, then we can worry about the fences." "With respect," Ross said carefully, "fixing those fences first would keep them from wandering off again once we bring them in." Willow opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. He was right, of course. It was the logical approach, one Daniel would have taken. Her stubbornness was getting in the way of good sense. "The fences, then," she conceded. Ross nodded, reassembling his revolver with practiced movements. "You have tools, I assume, in the barn. Some are in need of repair themselves." "I'll manage." He holstered his weapon and stood. "If you don't mind my asking, how many head are you expecting to find?" Willow hesitated, reluctant to reveal the true extent of her predicament. Daniel counted 15 after the rustlers left. They could be anywhere in the foothills by now. "15's not bad, enough to rebuild with if you're careful." He paused. "The rustlers, they were never caught." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Sheriff Parker has his suspicions, but no proof." Ross seemed to sense her reluctance to discuss it further. "Well, we'll focus on what we can control, starting with those fences." He moved toward the door. "I'll turn in now if that's all right. Dawn comes early." After he left, Willow sat alone at the table, torn between relief at having competent help and unease at allowing a stranger into her life. Ross Galloway seemed decent enough, but she'd learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. Still, something about his straightforward manner put her more at ease than she'd felt in months. With a weary sigh, she blew out the lamp and headed to her bedroom, trying to ignore how empty the house felt despite having another soul on the property. Ross proved true to his word. By mid-morning the next day, he had already repaired a significant stretch of the north pasture fence, working with an efficiency that impressed even Willow's critical eye. She brought him water around noon, watching as he drove another post into the hard ground. "Where did you learn ranch work?" she asked, handing him the dipper. Ross drank deeply before answering. "My family had a small spread in Texas before the war. Nothing fancy, but it taught me the basics." He handed the dipper back. "After that, I picked up work where I could find it. Spent some time on a big outfit in Wyoming, another in Montana." "You've traveled a lot," he shrugged. "Never found a reason to stay in one place too long. And Denver, what's waiting for you there? A job offer from an old Army friend. He's got a freight business, needs someone he can trust to run shipments." Ross wiped sweat from his brow. "Figured it might be time to stop drifting." Willow nodded, understanding the appeal of stability. "Well, you certainly know your way around fence repair. My husband would have appreciated your work." Something flickered in Ross's eyes at the mention of her husband, but his expression remained neutral. "He built a good place here." "We built it together," Willow corrected gently. "Every post, every board." "Then you know more about ranching than you let on," Ross observed with a slight smile. Willow returned the smile, surprising herself. "I suppose I do." The moment stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with something neither was ready to acknowledge. Willow broke it first, gesturing toward the house. "I should get back to my chores. There's stew for supper when you're done here." "Looking forward to it," Ross said, already turning back to his work. As Willow walked back to the house, she realized it was the first genuine smile that had crossed her face since Daniel's death. The thought brought both guilt and a strange sense of relief. That evening, as they ate together in the kitchen, Ross told her stories of his travels, tales of cattle drives and frontier towns, of characters he'd met along the way. His deep voice filled the lonely corners of the house, and Willow found herself laughing at his dry humor despite her determination to keep emotional distance. "You're a good storyteller, Mr. Galloway," she said as she cleared their plates. "Ross," he reminded her, "and thank you. Not much else to do on long trail rides except collect stories." Willow paused, her back to him as she stood at the wash basin. "How did you really hear about my situation? I doubt the sheriff is advertising my troubles to every stranger passing through." There was a moment of silence before Ross answered. "I was in the saloon when news came about the rustlers hitting your place, about your husband." His voice softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, Willow." She kept her hands busy with the dishes, blinking back unexpected tears. "Thank you. The sheriff mentioned you were determined to keep the ranch going but facing an uphill battle. I admire that kind of grit." Willow turned to face him, drying her hands on her apron. "It's not grit, it's necessity. This ranch is all I have left." Ross nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Either way, it takes courage. Not everyone would choose to fight when the odds are stacked against them." "And what would you know about my odds, Mr. Galloway?" There was an edge to her voice now. He met her gaze steadily. "I know that winter's coming. You're short on stock, and running a ranch isn't a one-person job even in the best of times." His tone remained gentle, not accusatory. "But I also know determination can overcome a lot of obstacles." Willow looked away first. "Well, we'll see if my determination is enough, won't we?" She hung up the dish towel with more force than necessary. "I should turn in. Tomorrow we can start looking for the cattle." Ross stood, recognizing the dismissal. "Yes, madam, I'll be ready at first light." After he left, Willow leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly exhausted. Ross Galloway saw too much, understood too much. It made her feel exposed in a way she wasn't comfortable with. Yet there was also comfort in being truly seen, in not having to pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. She shook her head, chiding herself for such thoughts. Ross was temporary help, nothing more. In a few weeks, he'd be gone to Denver, and she would be facing her challenges alone again. Best not to get used to his presence or his insights. The next morning broke clear and cold with frost silvering the grass. Willow dressed warmly and headed to the barn where she found Ross already saddling 2 horses. "Hope you don't mind," he said when he saw her. "Figured we'd get an early start." "Not at all." She approached the smaller of the 2 horses, a reliable bay mare named Penny. "You chose well." "Penny knows these hills better than I do." Ross nodded, adjusting the cinch on his own mount, a sturdy gelding. "I packed some provisions. We might be out all day." They rode out as the sun crested the eastern plains, casting long shadows across the land. Ross let Willow take the lead, following her into the foothills west of the ranch. The terrain grew rougher, dotted with pine stands and cut by narrow ravines. "The cattle favor the southern slopes," Willow explained over her shoulder. "There's better grass there and water in the creek that runs through." Ross pulled alongside her when the trail widened. "You've lived here long, 7 years. Daniel brought me here as a bride." A sad smile touched her lips. It was little more than a shack and a dream back then. "You've built something good," Ross observed, looking back toward the ranch buildings, now small in the distance. "We did," Willow corrected again. "And I intend to keep it." They rode in companionable silence after that, scanning the landscape for signs of cattle. Around mid-morning, Ross spotted tracks leading into a sheltered valley, and they found 8 of the missing cattle grazing peacefully beside a small stream. Willow's relief was palpable. "That's more than half of what's left." "Good start," Ross agreed. "Let's get them moving toward home, then continue the search." Working together, they herded the cattle back toward the ranch. Willow was impressed with Ross's skill. He anticipated the animals' movements, guiding them firmly but calmly. By late afternoon, they had recovered 12 of the 15 missing head and secured them in the newly repaired north pasture. As they dismounted by the barn, Willow felt a genuine surge of optimism for the first time in months. 3 more to find. "That's better than I dared hope for one day's work." Ross smiled, the expression warming his rugged features. "We make a good team." The simple statement shouldn't have affected her as it did. Willow turned away, busying herself with unsaddling Penny. "Yes, well, we were lucky. Good weather, cooperative cattle." If Ross noticed her sudden withdrawal, he didn't comment on it. Instead, he set about caring for his own horse, his movements efficient and practiced. "We should be able to find the last few tomorrow, weather permitting." That evening, the temperature dropped sharply, and Willow worried about Ross in the drafty barn. She brought him an extra blanket after supper, knocking softly on the tack room door. "Come in," he called. She found him sitting on his bedroll, reading a dog-eared book by lantern light. He looked up, surprise evident on his face when he saw the blanket in her arms. "Thought you might need this," she explained, suddenly feeling awkward. "It's getting colder tonight." "Thank you." He stood, taking the blanket from her with a genuine smile. "That's thoughtful of you." Willow glanced at the book he'd set aside. "What are you reading?" Ross picked it up, somewhat self-consciously. "Poems by Walt Whitman, not very cowboy-like, I suppose." "I wouldn't know what's cowboy-like and what isn't," Willow replied, curious despite herself. "Is it good?" "I think so." "Whitman understands something about America, about its spirit." He hesitated, then offered the book to her. "Would you like to borrow it?" The gesture touched her unexpectedly. Yes, thank you. I haven't had much time for reading lately, but no rush to return it." His blue eyes held hers for a moment. I've memorized most of my favorites anyway. Willow took the book, her fingers brushing his in the process. A jolt of awareness passed through her, startling in its intensity. She stepped back quickly. Well, good night then. Good night, Willow. And thank you for the blanket. She nodded and hurried back to the house, unsettled by her reaction. It had been so long since she'd felt anything beyond grief and determination that the spark of attraction caught her completely off guard. Worse, it felt like a betrayal of Daniel's memory. That night, Willow lay awake for hours, the borrowed book of poetry on her nightstand untouched. She told herself firmly that any feelings beyond professional respect for Ross Galloway were inappropriate and unwelcome. He was temporary help, nothing more. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, her practical mind whispered an inconvenient truth. Ross would be gone soon, and then she'd be alone again with a ranch too big for one person and a future too uncertain to face. The next day brought a shift in the weather. Dark clouds rolled in from the northwest, and a bitter wind whipped across the plains. Ross frowned at the sky as he and Willow prepared to ride out. "Storm's coming," he observed. "We should make this quick." Willow nodded, pulling her coat tighter. The last 3 cattle were likely heading for the old mining cabin in Cottonwood Canyon. There's a natural shelter there they seem to favor in bad weather. They rode hard, racing against the approaching storm. The wind grew stronger as they entered the canyon, carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. Sure enough, they found the remaining cattle huddled near the dilapidated cabin, seeking refuge from the worsening conditions. "We won't get them back before this hits full force," Ross called over the wind, gesturing toward the darkening sky. Willow surveyed their options quickly. "The cabin's still sound enough for shelter. We can wait out the worst of it there, then head back with the cattle once it passes." The decision made, they worked swiftly to secure the cattle in a natural corral formed by a bend in the canyon wall, then led their horses to the meager shelter of the cabin's lean-to. Inside, the one-room structure was dusty but intact, with a small stone fireplace along one wall. Ross immediately set about gathering what wood he could find while Willow cleared debris from the fireplace. Within minutes, he had a small fire crackling, providing welcome warmth as the storm intensified outside. "Good thing we packed provisions," Ross remarked, shaking snow from his coat. "Looks like we might be here a while." Willow nodded, trying to ignore the intimacy of their situation. The cabin was barely 12 feet square, with nothing but a rickety table, 1 chair, and the dusty plank floor for furnishings. "Old miners' shelter," she explained, unpacking their food. "Daniel and I used to stop here sometimes when checking fence lines." Ross noticed the shadow that crossed her face at the mention of her husband. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Willow's voice softened. "Kind, hardworking. He deserved better than what happened to him." "Do you mind if I ask what happened? The details, I mean." Willow was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. Daniel had been sick a wasting illness the doctor couldn't name. He was getting weaker, but still insisted on doing his share. She swallowed hard. "The rustlers came at night. We heard the cattle being driven off, and Daniel went out with his rifle despite my begging him to stay inside." Ross listened silently, his face grave. "He managed to wound one of them, but there were at least 3. They shot him." Her voice faltered. "He died in my arms out by the corral. I never saw their faces clearly." "I'm sorry," Ross said quietly. "No one should have to endure that." Willow wiped away a tear with the back of her hand. "The sheriff has suspicions a gang operating out of the New Mexico territory, but no proof. And meanwhile, I'm left with half a herd and a mortgage I can barely meet." "Is that why you wouldn't accept help from the townsfolk?" "The mortgage," She looked up sharply. "You've been asking questions." Ross shrugged, unapologetic. "People talk, especially about a woman determined to make it on her own." "It's not determination. It's pride," Willow admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "I won't be the object of their pity and charity. Charity has strings attached, even when people don't mean it to. Not everyone offering help expects something in return. Perhaps not, but accepting charity changes how people see you and how you see yourself." She met his gaze directly. "I won't surrender my dignity along with my husband." Understanding dawned in Ross's eyes. "That's why you were reluctant to hire me. You thought I was offering charity, weren't you? Room and board is hardly fair payment for the work you've done." A smile touched his lips. "I've had worse arrangements. And winter in a barn is better than winter on the trail." His expression grew more serious. "But you're right, I did want to help when I heard your story. Is that so terrible?" Willow looked away, uncomfortable with his directness. "No, but it makes me feel indebted." "Then consider it a business arrangement." Ross leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "You provide shelter and meals through the winter. In return, I help get your ranch back on solid footing. Come spring, we're square, and I'll be on my way to Denver. That's months of work you're offering." "I'm in no hurry, and I suspect neither of us wants to be alone when the real winter hits." He gestured toward the window, where snow was now falling heavily. Willow considered his offer, torn between practical necessity and stubborn independence. Finally, practicality won out. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. "A business arrangement, but I'll expect a full day's work every day." Ross smiled. "Yes, madam." The storm lasted through the night and into the next day. They took turns sleeping, one always keeping watch over the fire and the cattle outside. By the time the weather cleared enough to travel, a strange comfort had developed between them, a tentative trust born of shared hardship and honest conversation. The journey back to the ranch was slow, hampered by the fresh snow, but they arrived before nightfall with all 3 cattle intact. As they released the animals into the pasture with the others, Willow felt a weight lift from her shoulders. 15 head wasn't much, but it was something to build on. "Thank you," she said quietly as they walked toward the barn, "for your help these past few days." Ross nodded, his expression softening. "Glad to be of service, madam." "Willow," she reminded him, a small smile touching her lips. "Willow," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice, warmer, more personal. That night, for the first time since Daniel's death, Willow opened the book of poetry Ross had lent her. Whitman's words spoke of a vast, vital America of connection and possibility. She fell asleep with the book on her chest, dreaming not of the past, but of tomorrow. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of hard work and gradual healing. Ross proved to be as good as his word, tackling projects around the ranch that had gone neglected during Daniel's illness and after his death. He repaired the barn roof, reinforced the corral, and split enough firewood to last well into spring. Willow, for her part, began to allow herself small moments of joy again. She found herself humming as she worked in the kitchen, or pausing to watch the sunset from the porch. The crushing weight of grief hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted somehow, making room for other emotions. As November deepened toward December, Ross helped her slaughter one of the older steers for winter meat. They worked side by side all day, preserving what they could and preparing the rest for smoking. "You're good at this," Ross observed as Willow expertly packed salt into another jar of beef. She smiled slightly. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. My father made sure his daughters could handle any chore a son might do. Smart man." "He was," Willow agreed, her voice tinged with old sadness. "Lost him in '65 at Petersburg, Ross's hand stilled momentarily. "I was at Petersburg with the Union forces." Willow looked up, searching his face. "My father fought for the Confederacy. Does that trouble you?" "The war's been over a long time," Ross said quietly. "And good men fought on both sides, believing they were right." His response eased a tension Willow hadn't realized she was carrying. Daniel felt the same. "He served with the Colorado Volunteers, but he never held my father's allegiance against me." "Sounds like he was a wise man, too." "Yes." Willow sealed the jar she was working on and reached for another. "Though he'd probably think I was a fool for trying to keep the ranch going alone." Ross handed her more salt. "I doubt that. More likely he'd be proud of your determination." Their eyes met briefly, and Willow felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. She looked away quickly, focusing on her task. "The mortgage comes due next week," she said, changing the subject. "I need to ride into town tomorrow, speak with Mr. Finch at the bank." Ross nodded, recognizing her retreat. "Would you like company for the ride?" Willow hesitated. Appearing in town with Ross might start tongues wagging, but the truth was, she dreaded facing the banker alone. "If you wouldn't mind," she said finally, "I could use the support." The next morning dawned clear and cold as they rode side by side into La Junta. The small town was bustling with pre-Christmas activity. Storekeepers hanging decorations and freight wagons delivering goods for the holiday season. Willow felt the stares as they dismounted in front of the bank, curious glances and whispered comments following them as they entered the imposing brick building. She held her head high, refusing to acknowledge the gossip that was surely already spreading. Mr. Finch, the bank manager, was a thin, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a perpetual frown. He ushered them into his office with barely concealed impatience. "Mrs. Reynolds," he began without preamble, "I presume you're here about your mortgage payment." Willow sat straight-backed in the uncomfortable chair. "Yes, Mr. Finch. As you know, circumstances have been difficult since my husband's passing." The banker's expression didn't soften. "Indeed, most unfortunate. However, business is business, and the payment is due regardless of personal tragedy." Ross, standing quietly behind Willow's chair, stiffened at the man's callousness. Willow opened her reticule and carefully counted out bills and coins onto the desk, the sum representing nearly everything she had. "This is partial payment. I can provide the remainder after the spring sale." Finch eyed the money with visible disappointment. "This is less than half of what's owed, Mrs. Reynolds. I'm afraid the bank cannot accept partial payment." "Mr. Finch," Willow began, her voice remarkably steady, "I've never missed a payment before. I'm asking for a reasonable accommodation until spring." "The terms of your mortgage are quite clear, and I intend to honor them," Willow interrupted. "I'm simply requesting more time." The banker leaned back, steepling his fingers. "There are others interested in your property, Mrs. Reynolds, men with capital to develop the land properly. Perhaps selling would be the wisest course. The ranch is not for sale." Finch sighed dramatically. "Then I'm afraid the bank will have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings after the new year." Ross stepped forward. "How much is needed to prevent that?" Finch glanced up, seeming to truly notice Ross for the first time. "And you are?" "A friend," Ross replied evenly. "How much?" The banker named a sum that made Willow's heart sink. It was more than she could possibly raise before spring. To her shock, Ross reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet. He counted out bills and placed them beside Willow's contribution on the desk. "That should cover it," he said calmly. Willow stared at him in disbelief. "Ross, no, it's a loan," he said firmly, meeting her gaze with unwavering certainty. "Between business partners." Mr. Finch looked between them, clearly reassessing the situation. "I see," he said, reaching for the money. Well, this is most satisfactory. After he'd written out a receipt and they'd left the bank, Willow rounded on Ross in the street, heedless of curious onlookers. "How dare you?" she demanded, her voice low but intense. "I never asked for your charity." "It's not charity," Ross replied evenly. "It's a loan, as I said. You can repay me after the spring sale." "With what interest?" she asked bitterly. "What's your price, Mr. Galloway? A share of my ranch, or something else?" Hurt flashed in his eyes, quickly masked. "I don't want anything from you, Willow, except maybe your trust," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I have savings, money that's just sitting in my saddlebags doing nothing. Why not put it to good use?" "Because I can't repay you if spring doesn't bring the prices we hope for," Willow argued, though some of the fire had gone out of her voice. "I won't be indebted to anyone, Ross, not even you." "Then consider it an investment in our business arrangement," he suggested. "I work the winter, you provide room and board, and come spring we split the profits from the sale. If there's enough to repay the loan, you do. If not—" He shrugged. "I took a gamble and lost, no different than a hand of poker." Willow studied his face, searching for ulterior motives but finding only sincerity. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "All right, but we'll draw up proper papers, everything clear and above board." Relief washed over Ross's features. "Whatever you say, partner." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Willow broke the silence. "Why did you really do it, Ross?" He considered the question carefully before answering. "Because everyone deserves a fighting chance." "And because—" he hesitated. "Because I care what happens to you, Willow, more than I probably should." The simple honesty of his answer stole her prepared defenses. Before she could formulate a response, Ross urged his horse forward, leaving her to follow with a mind full of confusion and a heart beating faster than it had any right to. December arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow. The ranch seemed smaller, more intimate, with the vast prairie blanketed in white and the world beyond reduced to occasional trips into town for supplies. Willow and Ross fell into domestic routines that felt at once strange and surprisingly natural. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire after supper, Ross often reading aloud from his small collection of books while Willow mended clothes or worked on quilting. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing stories of their pasts and cautious hopes for the future. Ross spoke of his childhood in Texas, his service during the war, and his years of drifting afterward. Willow told him about growing up in Missouri, meeting Daniel at a church social, and their journey west to build a life together. "You ever regret coming here?" Ross asked one evening as a blizzard howled outside the snug cabin. Willow considered the question, needle pausing in its rhythmic motion. "No," she said finally. "Even with everything that's happened, I love this land. It gets into your blood somehow." Ross nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That it does. What about you? All those years moving from place to place, were you looking for something specific?" He stared into the fire for a long moment. "Peace, maybe. After the war, I couldn't seem to settle anywhere, too many memories." He smiled ruefully. "Or maybe I was just running from them." "And now, are you still running?" Their eyes met across the warm room, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing despite both their efforts to deny them. "Not anymore," Ross said softly. "For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I want to be." Willow looked away first, her heart racing. "It's getting late. I should turn in." Ross didn't try to stop her retreat, but his eyes followed her to the door. "Good night, Willow." "Good night, Ross." In the safety of her bedroom, Willow pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had promised Daniel that she would focus solely on saving the ranch. Yet here she was, falling for a drifting cowboy who would be gone come spring. The realization that she was indeed falling in love with Ross Galloway hit her with the force of a physical blow. She sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by guilt and confusion. How could she betray Daniel's memory this way? How could she open herself to more heartache when Ross inevitably left? Yet denying her feelings seemed equally impossible. In the weeks since Ross's arrival, the ranch had transformed from a burden to be carried alone to a home filled with possibility again. And Willow herself had begun to feel alive in ways she'd thought lost forever. Christmas approached with a tension between them that neither seemed willing to address directly. They continued their work and their evening conversations, but both carefully avoided any topic that might lead back to that moment of vulnerability by the fire. On Christmas Eve, Willow surprised Ross with a special supper venison roast, preserved vegetables from her garden, and an apple pie made with the last of her hoarded fruit. "What's the occasion?" he asked, genuinely touched by the effort. "Christmas," she replied simply. "And a thank you for everything you've done." Ross smiled, the expression warming his blue eyes. "You didn't have to go to such trouble." "I wanted to." Willow hesitated, then added softly, "It's been a long time since I've had reason to celebrate anything." After they'd eaten, Ross disappeared briefly to the barn, returning with a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. "Merry Christmas," he said, somewhat self-consciously, placing it on the table before her. Willow stared at the package in surprise. "Ross, you shouldn't have. It's nothing fancy," he assured her. "Just something I thought you might like." With tentative fingers, Willow unwrapped the gift. Inside lay a beautifully carved wooden box, small enough to fit in her palm, with delicate flowers etched into the lid. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate design. "Open it," Ross encouraged. Inside the box was a silver brooch, simple but elegant, shaped like a willow leaf. "I saw it in the general store when we were in town last week," Ross explained. "It reminded me of you, strong but graceful." Willow blinked back sudden tears. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." His voice was gentle, understanding. "I just wanted to give you something beautiful, no strings attached." The sincerity in his eyes undid the last of Willow's carefully constructed barriers. Without thinking, she leaned across the table and pressed her lips to his in a brief, soft kiss. She pulled back almost immediately, shocked by her own boldness. "I'm sorry I shouldn't have." Ross captured her hand in his, preventing her retreat. "Don't apologize," he said quietly. "Not for that." They sat in charged silence, hands still joined across the table. Finally, Willow spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid, Ross." "Of what?" "Of feeling again, of losing again." She met his gaze directly. "Of you leaving when spring comes." Ross's grip tightened on her hand. "What if I didn't leave?" Hope and fear warred in Willow's expression. "You have plans in Denver, a future waiting." "Plans change. Futures can be reimagined." He stood, moving around the table to kneel beside her chair. "Willow, I've spent years drifting, never finding a place that felt like home, until now, until you." Tears spilled onto Willow's cheeks. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," Ross said firmly. "I know you're the strongest, most determined woman I've ever met. I know you face each day with courage, even when you're terrified inside. And I know that somehow, against all odds, I've fallen in love with you." The declaration hung in the air between them, impossible to take back or ignore. "I'm not asking for promises," Ross continued when Willow remained silent. "Just a chance. Time to show you that what I feel is real and lasting." Willow touched his face, her fingers trembling slightly. Daniel was my whole world for so long. I never imagined there could be anyone else. I'm not trying to replace him, Ross said gently. I wouldn't want to erase what you had together, but maybe there's room in your heart for a different kind of love. Willow closed her eyes, tears streaming freely now. When she opened them again, there was a new resolve in her gaze. Yes, she whispered. There is. This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no retreat, only the sweet certainty of two hearts finding harbor after long, separate journeys through storms. Winter deepened, blanketing the Colorado plains in snow and wrapping the ranch in peaceful isolation. Inside the small house, Willow and Ross built a different kind of warmth, their relationship blossoming despite the frozen world outside. They were careful with each other, mindful of Willow's still healing grief and Ross's long-standing habit of independence. They shared kisses by the fire, held hands during their evening conversations, and gradually allowed themselves to imagine a future together. Ross moved his things from the barn to the small spare room, a compromise that respected propriety while acknowledging the shift in their relationship. In town, they made no secret of their partnership, though they kept the romantic aspect private, a precious thing still too new and fragile for public scrutiny. January brought a temporary thaw, allowing them to check the cattle and make necessary repairs around the property. The animals had weathered the cold well, and Ross estimated they might have calves as early as April. We could rebuild the herd faster than I'd hoped, Willow remarked as they walked back from the pasture one afternoon, their breath clouding in the crisp air. If the market holds, we could be on solid footing by next winter, Ross agreed. Willow glanced at him, noting his use of we with a warm flutter in her chest. You're really staying then? No regrets about Denver? Ross stopped, turning to face her fully. No regrets, he said firmly. My friend will find someone else for his freight business. This is where I want to be. Willow smiled, her eyes reflecting the winter sunlight. I'm glad. That evening, as they sat side by side on the porch swing despite the cold, Ross broached a subject they'd both been avoiding. Willow, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. She nodded, suddenly apprehensive. Of course. The loan for the mortgage payment, I told you it was just business, but the truth is, I never expected repayment. He held up a hand to forestall her protest. Not because I thought you couldn't do it, but because I didn't care about the money. I only cared about keeping you safe on your land. Willow stiffened slightly. So it was charity after all. No, Ross said emphatically. It was love, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I just knew I couldn't bear to see you lose everything you'd worked for. Her expression softened at his words. Ross, please let me finish. He took a deep breath. I want to tear up that loan agreement, not as charity, but because if we're building a life together, what's mine is yours anyway. Willow was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, she shook her head. No, she said firmly. I appreciate what you're offering, but I need to honor my debts. It's important to me, Ross. It's about self-respect. Instead of arguing, he smiled, pride evident in his eyes. I thought you might say that. How about a compromise then? I'm listening. We keep the agreement, but consider it an investment in our partnership, both business and personal. You don't owe me. We owe ourselves. Willow turned the idea over in her mind, testing it against her pride and finding no conflict. That seems fair. Ross's smile widened. Good, because there's something else I want to ask you. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. This was my mother's. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to. Willow's breath caught as Ross took her hand. Willow Reynolds, will you marry me? Not because you need help with the ranch, or because I need a home, but because somehow in these past months you've become the center of my world. Tears filled Willow's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Ross Galloway." He slipped the ring onto her finger, where it sat alongside the simple band Daniel had given her years before. Seeing her glance at the two rings together, Ross spoke gently. "You can keep his ring too if you want. I understand what he meant to you." Willow shook her head, slowly removing Daniel's ring. "No, Daniel will always have a place in my heart, but this is a new beginning for us. His ring belongs with my memories." She leaned forward, kissing Ross with a tenderness that held both gratitude for the past and hope for the future. February brought more snow and the news that the men suspected of rustling their cattle and killing Daniel had been captured in New Mexico territory. Sheriff Parker rode out personally to inform them, his weathered face solemn as he related the details. "They confessed to several raids in the area," he told them as they sat around Willow's kitchen table. "Including yours. The ringleader fellow named Cates is wounded, just like you said, madam, shot in the shoulder." Willow's hands trembled slightly and Ross covered them with his own, lending strength. "Will they be brought back here for trial?" she asked. The sheriff nodded. "For the murder charges, yes, probably late spring once the weather's better for travel." After he left, Willow stood at the window for a long time watching the snow fall. Ross gave her space, understanding her need to process the news alone. Finally, she turned to him, her expression resolute. "I want to see them when they're brought to trial. I need to look them in the eye." Ross nodded, not trying to dissuade her. "I'll be right beside you." The knowledge that Daniel's killers would face justice brought Willow a measure of peace. In the weeks that followed, she seemed lighter somehow, more willing to embrace joy without guilt. She and Ross began planning their wedding for early April. A simple ceremony before the spring roundup would claim their full attention. March arrived with warming temperatures and the first signs of new life. Green shoots appeared where the snow had melted, and one morning, Ross discovered a newborn calf in the pasture, the first of what promised to be a healthy spring crop. "It's a good omen," Willow declared, watching the wobbly-legged creature nurse from its mother. Ross slipped an arm around her waist. "One of many, I hope." Their wedding day dawned clear and mild, the prairie awakening from winter's sleep all around them. They were married in the small church in La Junta, with Reverend Simmons officiating and most of the town in attendance. Whatever gossip had circulated about their unusual arrangement had given way to genuine good wishes as the community witnessed their dedication to each other and to the ranch. Willow wore a simple blue dress with Ross's Christmas gift, the willow leaf brooch pinned at her collar. Ross had purchased a new suit for the occasion, though he looked somewhat uncomfortable in the formal attire after months in work clothes. "You look beautiful," he whispered as they stood before the reverend. Willow smiled up at him, her heart full. "So do you." After the ceremony, the townsfolk gathered at the ranch for a celebration that lasted well into the evening. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, joyful sounds that seemed to banish the last shadows of grief from the small house. As night fell and the last guests departed, Ross and Willow stood on the porch, arms around each other, watching the stars emerge above their land. "Happy?" Ross asked softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "More than I ever thought possible again," Willow admitted. She turned in his embrace to face him. "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I was too proud to accept help." Ross smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thank you for teaching me what it means to put down roots." Later, in the privacy of what was now their bedroom, they came together as husband and wife, their love expressed in tender touches and whispered devotion. And if Willow felt a momentary pang of guilt, it was quickly replaced by the certainty that Daniel would have wanted her to find happiness again. Spring unfolded in earnest across the ranch, bringing new calves, green grass, and long days of shared labor. Ross and Willow worked side by side, their partnership strengthened by love and common purpose. The loan that had once been a point of contention between them was now a symbol of their joint investment in the future. In late May, as promised, Daniel's killers were brought to La Junta for trial. Willow attended each day of the proceedings, Ross steadfast beside her. When asked to testify about the night of the murder, she spoke with clear-eyed dignity that impressed even the hardened judge. "You seek the death penalty for these men, Mrs. Galloway?" The prosecutor asked after she'd given her account. Willow looked at the three defendants, rough men with hard faces who had destroyed her first chance at happiness. Then she glanced at Ross, whose unwavering support had given her a second. "No," she said finally. "Justice doesn't require more death, but they should never have the freedom to harm another family." The judge sentenced the men to life imprisonment, a verdict that brought Willow closure if not complete peace. As she and Ross rode home after the trial's conclusion, she felt as though the final page of a difficult chapter had been turned. "Are you all right?" Ross asked as they approached the ranch. Willow considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I think I am." The cattle sale in June exceeded even their most optimistic projections. Beef prices had risen, and their calves were strong and healthy. With the profits, they were able to repay the bank loan in full and still have money to invest in expanding the herd. "I never doubted you'd do it," Ross told her proudly as they left the bank, the mortgage note marked paid in full safely tucked in Willow's reticule. "We did it together," she corrected him, squeezing his hand. "And now we need to discuss what to do about your loan." Ross shook his head. "I told you that was an investment in our partnership. It's already been repaid 100 times over in happiness." "Nevertheless," Willow insisted, "I want everything between us to be equal. No debts, no obligations, just love freely given and received." They compromised by using part of the remaining profits to purchase adjoining land that had recently come on the market, land that would allow them to expand the ranch significantly in the coming years. "Now it truly belongs to both of us," Willow declared as they rode the boundaries of their new property. "Built with your investment and my determination." Ross laughed, the sound carrying across the open prairie. "Always stubborn." "You wouldn't have me any other way," she retorted with a smile. "No," he agreed, his expression softening. "I wouldn't change a single thing about you, Willow Galloway." Summer stretched into fall, and with the changing seasons came news that brought both joy and trepidation. Willow was expecting a child in early spring. "Are you happy?" she asked Ross when she told him, uncertainty in her eyes despite the smile on her lips. He answered by sweeping her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen until they were both laughing breathlessly. "Is that a yes?" Willow asked when he finally set her down. Ross cupped her face in his hands. "It's an I love you beyond words," he replied, kissing her tenderly. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Willow found herself increasingly relying on Ross as winter approached once more. He took on extra chores without complaint, hired a young ranch hand to help with the heavier work, and made sure Willow rested when needed, though she often protested that she wasn't an invalid. "Humor me," Ross would say, bringing her tea or an extra blanket. "I've waited my whole life to take care of someone I love." Christmas that year was a jubilant affair, with the house decorated more elaborately than Willow had bothered with in years. They exchanged simple gifts: a new hat for Ross, a rocking chair for Willow, and made plans for the nursery they would create in the small room adjacent to their bedroom. "Boy or girl?" Ross wondered aloud as they sat by the fire, his hand resting on Willow's growing belly. "Girl," Willow said confidently, "with your blue eyes and stubborn chin." Ross chuckled. "If she has your determination, we're in for quite a ride." As the new year of 1880 began, they celebrated not only the promise of their child but the anniversary of Ross's arrival at the ranch. So much had changed in a single year, from grief and uncertainty to love and hope for the future. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Willow asked as they stood on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered prairie in shades of gold and pink. "Not in my wildest dreams," Ross admitted. "I was just looking for work and a warm place to spend the winter. And I was too proud to accept help," Willow added with a rueful smile. "Thank God for clever solutions," Ross said, pulling her close against the cold. "And for loans that never needed repayment." Willow turned in his arms, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. "The loan may not have been repaid in money, but it has been repaid in love 1,000 times over." "The best investment I ever made," Ross agreed, lowering his lips to hers. Their child, a daughter they named Hannah, was born on a bright April morning, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and new calves dotting the pastures. She had Ross's blue eyes and Willow's determination, evident from her first lusty cry. As Willow held their daughter while Ross looked on with wonder and pride, she thought of all the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. The loss and grief that had nearly broken her, the pride that had almost prevented her from accepting help, the compassion disguised as a business arrangement that had saved not just her ranch but her heart. "She's perfect," Ross whispered, gently touching Hannah's tiny hand. "She is," Willow agreed. "And so is this life we've built together." Outside the window, the ranch spread before them, cattle grazing peacefully, fields waiting to be planted, endless sky promising both challenges and blessings in the years to come. It wasn't the life Willow had originally imagined for herself, but as she looked at her husband and daughter, she knew with absolute certainty that it was exactly where she was meant to be. The loan that Ross had offered and Willow had reluctantly accepted had long since been transformed into something far more valuable. A partnership built on respect, a love founded on honesty, and a future limited only by the horizon itself. 5 years later, the Reynolds Galloway Ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in southeastern Colorado. With careful management and hard work, Ross and Willow had expanded their herd to over 200 head and added sheep and horses to their enterprise. The small house had been enlarged to accommodate their growing family, which now included Hannah and her 3-year-old brother, Daniel, named in honor of the man whose memory Willow still cherished. On the anniversary of their wedding each year, Ross and Willow would ride together to the highest point on their property, where they could see for miles in every direction. There, with the wind in their hair and the vast prairie spread before them, they would renew their commitment to each other and to the life they had built together. "Any regrets?" Ross would ask, though he already knew the answer. And Willow would smile, thinking of the proud, grieving widow she had once been and the journey that had led her to true partnership and lasting love. "Not a single one," she would reply, reaching for her husband's hand. "Every step brought me here to you." And that was worth more than all the gold in Colorado, a truth that needed no repayment, only gratitude for the loan that had become love.